Welcome to the Voices That Propel Us, stories of justice, action, and community, a space where justice meets action and community voices rise. Each episode, we bring you stories from the front lines, changemakers, disruptors, and everyday heroes who are building a more just, equitable, and liberated world. This is more than a podcast. It's a call to listen, learn, and move together. You were just listening to music from the incredibly talented Stephen Kong. You can find him on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today we have with us Torrey. Torrey worked in the children's book industry for 20 years as an author, speaker, and teacher. Torrey is also a co-founder of the charity Orphans Africa and served as executive director for 7 years. Torrey is concerned about social justice and feels compelled to write about ordinary people faced with issues of moral complexity. Ultimately, she longs to bring healing and forgiveness to a divided world. Fox Creek is Torrey's award-winning debut novel for an adult audience. Well, hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have you here today and learn more about the stories and the book that you've written. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, wonderful. So just starting off, so you spent 20 years in the children's book industry before writing your adult novel, Fox Creek. So what led you to this shift in your writing journal from like children's book to what you just wrote?
It actually was an intermingling journey. It wasn't, one journey stop, then the next journey. In fact, I started my writing career for children back in the early to mid 90s, and was first published as a children's author, I think back in 1997. But actually, the genesis for Fox Creek, which is my adult novel, started back at the same time. And it started with a trip to New Orleans. My husband was going to be going to a conference there. Now, I live in Washington State, and he asked me, "Do you want to come?" And of course, I said yes, because I'd never been. So I did some research before I left, because I thought I'm going to base a children's book in New Orleans. And I thought, what better but to write a ghost story, because it's a spooky city. So I get there and I'm all armed with my research, but nothing was coming together at all. No story was really grabbing me, saying, write me, write me. So I thought, okay, well, I'll rent a car and I'll go up north, kind of north of Baton Rouge, and I'll visit some plantations because, this may be the last time I'm here. I've never seen one. I've always wanted to. So I go to about 10 plantations, I'd say, because they're really close. They're on a place called River Road, and you just go from one to the next. And I was, as a Northern girl, really expecting, I realized naively in retrospect, that the tours would be basically a balanced rendition of history. But instead, what I encountered was a very one-sided rendition of history, whitewashed, as you can imagine.
Right.
And it was just about, the white family that might have lived in the big house and who they were, where they came from, what they did, and, all about the white family. And I was amazed that not once was slavery mentioned.
Oh, wow.
So not once, and I was, golly.
Wow.
So then after the tours, I would go, walking around the grounds, and always, or usually in the back of the big house, a distance would be a couple of slave cabins. And then I'd go in and, you see the disparity, but that bothered me as a Northern girl. I thought, okay, this rendition of history is one-sided. It's been whitewashed.
Right.
And what happened to the other side of history? What happened to the part of history that made that white life possible? And so I came home on fire. My ghost story went completely out the window. Instead, I come home on fire. I'm like, I have to write a book about basically the plantation system, but about how the white narrative intersects with that Black narrative. It can't be
Mhm.
just one, it can't be just the other,
Right.
but it has to be both. And so I thought also, there's no way this can be a children's book because of
Mhm.
its thematic materials. It's got to be a book for adults. And so I immediately jumped into about 3 years of research for this book.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that I had done it well. And so I started writing way back in the 90s.
Wow, no, thank you for sharing that. I just want to take it back a little to what you were talking about, the children's book. So, I apologize. I'm not too familiar with your work with the children's book, but did you write any like children's books around like social justice themes or, racial dynamics or anything? And I'm just thinking because I actually have a 10-year-old daughter, and I remember even when she was little, I was surprised like how many, I was, surprised as well as like proud to see how many books there were directed at children. I think one of my friends gave me a gift called A for activist, and it was basically like a alphabet for activism. So yeah, I was just wondering if like you were able to touch those kind of issues, because I feel like people are never too young to learn and be exposed to these kind of issues too. So I'm just curious to see if like you've ever explored those kind of issues, when you were writing your children's books.
I did when I got later in my career.
Okay.
I had a couple of children's book series. One was about science, so not
Okay.
so much the social aspects, but more about introducing children to science, include boys and girls.
That's
And
wonderful.
then I had a series with Random House, and it was called Chronicles of Courage.
Mm-hmm.
And there were three books in that series, and Voyage of Ice, Voyage of Plunder, and
Okay.
Voyage of Midnight. And Voyage of Midnight was about the African slave trade.
Okay.
So I did very much delve into the African slave trade and touched on the idea of justice and so on.
Okay.
You do have to be careful when you're writing for kids. It's very, very different than writing for adults.
Right.
You have all kinds of rules and parameters that you really have to stay within. Whereas
Okay.
with adults, kind of sky's the limit. You can write what you want.
Okay, thank you for sharing. That's
Yeah.
interesting. So, your work often explores moral complexity. So, what draws you to writing stories where there aren't easy answers?
I don't think of the world in terms of black and white.
Yeah,
I always think of the world in terms of different shades of gray. And,
right.
no one is truly evil. No one is truly, truly all good.
Hmm.
Maybe in our heart of hearts, in our higher self, yes, we are.
Hmm.
But as far as our human selves in this human shell, no, we're always, a little bit of everything. And I find that to think in those terms makes the world much more fascinating
Mm.
and also much more difficult to try to comprehend. So I'm always exploring those areas in between of
Okay.
of good and evil, of so like the intersection of black and white. My characters in my book Fox Creek, nobody is purely one way or purely
Mhm.
another. Everybody is very human.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of the way I see the world, and that's the way I like to write my characters.
Yeah, I think what really drew me towards you and your work too, I feel like we have a lot of similarities in our values too, because I also feel we're living in a world right now. I don't know how you feel, but I feel like there's so much division and so much polarization. Actually, that's why I wanted to start this podcast because I'm like, let me just have conversations with people that I might agree with or might disagree with. But I really want to just show people that we just need to talk with each other. I feel like there's so much name calling, a lot of hatred just going on. So with that, you said that you want to bring healing and forgiveness to a divided world. So what do you think sparked that desire in you?
Well, I do. I think I've always been a compassionate person. Okay, I
Okay.
feel I feel deeply
Right.
about other people. I care deeply about other people, and it
Hmm.
doesn't matter what you believe or who you are. I just care deeply. It's part of my DNA. It's part of who I am. Um, And I do also, later in my life, in the 2000s, I went back to college and got a master's in religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a minister as well. And my thesis was in eco-justice.
Okay.
So this eco-justice is takes into account the environmental harm
Mm-hmm.
that we as humanity have been perpetrating upon the earth, and how that has affected not only, everyday people, but most especially
Mm-hmm.
marginalized communities. Okay, so
Right.
communities that are not powerful, who don't necessarily have a voice, or if they do
Mm-hmm.
have a voice, they're ignored because they have no
Right.
power. And so that's eco justice, and so that studying that really awakened me to these dynamics that are playing out
Mm-hmm.
today about power, about
Mm-hmm.
justice, about people who have the right, but don't necessarily know how to get that right.
Right.
So yes, that's been my study. That's been how I move in the world and how I filter my thoughts about the world.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that too.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's something that I'm also thinking about. But how do you like honor and share like these voices and stories of marginalized communities without like making them sensational though, like sensationalizing? I feel like that happens a lot in entertainment and across like different kind of media. So how do you really honor like these stories and yeah, just being honest with it, but also like maybe having it in a perspective where people can start to respect, I think seeing people because I've done a lot of social justice work with like racial justice and working with marginalized communities, and I feel like there is a lot of dehumanization. So, do you feel like you're putting that humanity to marginalized communities in your work? And yeah, I'd just love to hear like what kind of responsibility do you feel that you have as a writer?
Right. Well, as a writer,
Mhm.
often I write historical
Okay.
fiction. So that's the case with Fox Creek. It takes place on a plantation.
Hmm.
Back in 1843 is when it starts. And my goal with this, just like none of my characters are totally good or totally evil,
Hmm.
um, they also are a broad spectrum of,
Okay.
you know, um, what you might expect. What I find in novels and movies today, especially considering the American South during slave days, is
Hmm.
often the worst case scenario. So you've
Okay.
got a white owner who is cruel, and then the person who is being um, brutalized.
Hmm.
So 12 Years as a Slave would be an example that's based on
Right.
a true story. There's other ones as well, but what I tried to do, rather than presenting a worst case scenario, which those did happen,
Right.
obviously, was create a middle of the line scenario. Okay,
Okay.
so that we can see what kind of everybody
Hmm.
who wasn't at the extreme would have experienced. And what my research showed me
Uh-huh.
is that just like humans everywhere, as far as slaveholders went, we had the very benign and the very cruel, including psychopaths. And then we
Hmm.
had everybody in between. And so if you have a bell curve, and I have a background in science as
Okay.
well. So if you have a bell curve, your bell
Right.
curve's going to go like that. Your cruel are going to be over here. Your benign are going to be over here. Everybody else is going to be somewhere in this bell curve.
Mm.
Okay, so I picked right down the center.
Okay.
Okay. So some days life might be okay on the plantation, and my plantation owner, who writes in his journal might say, comment on the weather or this or that, or,
Hmm.
I had my hands, they called them hands. I had my hands down in this field hoeing,
Hmm.
and things are going well. And then the next week, he had to whip some of them because they didn't do their work. So you have this, and he writes that with all dispassion. So it's
Okay.
all part of the work, And I found that, and it's actually based on an actual journal that I read. I found that kind of disconnect of his disconnect
Mm-hmm.
Really fascinating, because here's this normal person
Uh-huh.
who goes through life as, if you were to meet him in real life, you'd think, wow, what a great person. He loves his family, he's good to his neighbors. If somebody's sick, he'll send over people to help them. He votes, he does his civic duty, on and on. And yet he also will perpetrate violence against the slaves if they break any of his rules, which he
Okay.
set forth. And yet he does that with complete, almost a separation of, I
Right.
live my life as a good man here,
Mm.
and I take care of, plantation management over here. Now, this diary that I read that this guy's based on, it's called Plantation Life in the Florida Parishes,
Okay.
1843 to 1846. And the Florida parishes were actually part of Louisiana during
Mm-hmm.
that time. And it's a man named Bennett Barrow, and he lived in the place that my book is set. And one day he did keep this journal, and one day he recounts how he asked his wife, am I a good man? And she apparently pondered and then said, yes, I believe you are. And he said, I don't believe I've harmed anyone in my whole life.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And this was toward the end of the journal,
Okay.
after he'd given all these whippings and done all these things.
Wow.
And it blew me away,
Mm.
because it opened the door into his worldview.
Right.
Who
Right.
does he believe he is? Well, he believes himself to be a good person,
Okay.
even while he is, keeping the peace on the plantation by
Mm-hmm.
administering whippings. Sometimes he has the dogs, as he calls them, overhaul somebody because they ran away, or he puts an iron collar around somebody's neck because they keep running away, on and on and on, these different punishments. He does all that. And at the same time,
Mm.
has this simultaneous view of himself as a good person.
Okay.
Very important to understand. And the reason it's
Yeah.
important is because these were ordinary human beings. Think the bell curve.
Right.
Ordinary human beings. They weren't all monsters. I'm all
Mm-hmm.
monsters over here, psychopaths. They weren't all psychopaths. They were ordinary human beings
Uh-huh.
doing extraordinary harm. Why?
Right.
Because society permitted it. It was okay.
Okay.
So, and you
Wow.
think in today's terms, some of today's atrocities are being mainstreamed.
Right.
Ordinary, good hearted people are saying, oh, well, I guess that's okay.
Yeah. No, and I actually been talking to some white friends about this too, because they were just wondering because I also studied race when I was in school, and just like talking about like white supremacy and everything, and like I've been talking to people that, yeah, like, because someone I think said that they're racist or something. I had to explain, like, it doesn't mean that you're blatantly racist, in terms of being overt or anything, but it's just that, as white folks, we want to work in solidarity to dismantle white supremacy too. So even if, like, they don't feel like they hold even judgments or biases or anything, it's like those little acts that still promote white supremacy. So I want to have folks, I don't know, because I've also heard people saying that, I don't know, people of color or whatever, like, we're attacking white people. It's like, no, we're not trying to attack folks. It's this whole system that you're, even like you were talking about, that's incredible to me, like, to see how he didn't see those acts as being harmful. So I'm wondering if it's like that dehumanization or just seeing it just as a job. But yeah, that's
Right.
that's incredible.
So, yeah, that's very complex what you've just stated, and lots of
Hmm.
components.
Hmm.
So, as far as Bennett Barrow went, He believed that if you have rules for the
Okay.
plantation, kind of like raising children, if you
Mhm.
have rules and everybody knows the rules, and
Okay.
then if you break, rule number four, the
Mhm.
punishment for rule number four, oh, let's follow it across. Oh, that's 10 lashes with the whip.
Wow.
If everybody knows, then when they're punished, who do they blame? They only can blame themselves, right?
Wow.
So that's what he believed, and he believed he didn't have an overseer. He believed an overseer was not well invested in the
Okay.
proceedings, so he only trusted himself to do this. So he's the one administering punishments. Um,
Mhm.
so that was his view. Did it really work? On,
Uh-huh.
on some level, I think it probably did. But on
Okay.
another level, no matter what, you're not giving them their freedom. And so no matter
Right.
what, you're denying them their humanity. And back then, slaves were only considered, or Black people were only considered three-fifths of a human.
Mhm.
So the law enabled you to say, I'm a good
Right.
person. I've never harmed a human
Yeah.
in my life. Oh, not, but they don't count because they're
Wow.
only three-fifths, right? So, it gets complex there. And, if he were sitting here being asked these
Mhm.
questions, he may not even be able to answer them. I'm not really
Okay.
sure.
Yeah.
Um, but it is interesting to try to fathom all that out. Now, as far as white supremacy and
Mhm.
talking to white people in general about
Mhm.
race relations and so on. That is one of the reasons why I do
Oh, okay.
podcasts. It's not that
Yeah.
I want white people to feel like, oh, I'm pointing the
Mhm.
finger at you, or
Right.
that we need to be ashamed. I think that guilt and shame over any of this is misplaced. I think
Right.
for one thing, obviously none of us were alive back then. So
Mhm.
none of us perpetrated slavery, but we are the inheritors of that institution,
Yeah.
and everything that brought to our present day. And sometimes we don't even know what it brought because it's
Right.
so subversive, it's so hidden. So as white people, and especially I point to myself,
Mhm.
when I was doing this research, the scales fell off my eyes as to how
Oh,
privileged
okay.
I was as a white person. And if you're white, you are privileged. And just privileged by the nature of being white. You've never had to concern yourself when you're pulled over by a cop. Were you
Mhm.
pulled over because you're Black? That was never a
Yeah.
question, you had to ask yourself, were you pulled over because you're white? No.
Right.
You're just asking, well, what did I do? Did I run a traffic light? Did I whatever? So, in that little thing, we're privileged. Um, so with a white person, with us as white people, with
Mhm.
myself, nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect.
No.
Are we still learning? Absolutely. I'm still uncovering little ways in which my assumptions
Mhm.
about race aren't quite correct or
Yeah.
might be hurtful to somebody who's Black. And rather than point the finger at myself and say, well, that means I'm racist, that's not helpful either. And it's
Yeah.
probably not even true. Do I believe that all people are created equal? I absolutely do.
Right.
So, pointing at each other and say, well, you're racist. No, you're racist,
Mhm.
is not helpful.
Right.
So instead, it's just being open to correction, being open to looking at the little ways that we just might need to tweak how we speak
Yeah.
or how we think. And, Black people can help us by just gently pointing out
Mhm.
maybe perhaps ways that we might be able to say it better the next time.
No, I think, I agree with you about that too. But I've also heard it's just like, I think we're to like have that fine line too, because I think people of color too, like we feel sometimes, white people might look at us and hold that responsibility of like, what should we do? But whereas like, I've actually had a lot of folks too, I'd recommend to checking them out on the podcast, but like white people doing work with other white people on that too. And yeah, I think sometimes I've heard that from folks who like people of color feeling that burden of like having to be, speaking. and I've also been like,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
spaces where the only person of color in the room, and they're like, "Oh, what do Asians think about this?"
yeah.
And I'm
Totally
like, I
get
can
it.
say
Yeah.
what I say, but like, yeah, I think I also want to encourage people to also do the work and not just
Yes,
put all of the work
absolutely.
on top of, people of
Yes.
color.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, there's a good book called White Fragility. Oh,
Oh,
now,
I heard of
have
that.
you heard of
Yeah.
that? Oh, her
Yes.
first
Yeah.
name's Kate.
Mm-hmm.
I think her last name's D'Angelo. Um,
Okay.
very, very good. And she's white.
Okay.
And she used to go into corporate workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
and it was her job, teamed up with a woman of color, her
Okay.
job, and this other person, I can't remember her name, to kind of foster discussion
Mm-hmm.
with groups of people about how to, be more sensitive
Oh,
to
I love
issues
that.
of race and how to talk about race. And so it was her kind of feedback on what she learned
Oh,
in
okay.
those group discussions about how fragile white people are about talking about race.
Yeah.
We run from it. We don't want to talk about it because we don't want to be thought to be racist. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a very scary notion,
Right.
to have to talk about it. And why do we have to talk about it? Can I just live my life? Can I just pick up my kids from school and go grocery shopping and just live my life? Why
Mm-hmm.
why do I have to talk about it? And it goes back to kind of, my book, Fox Creek, and
Yeah.
the legacy of slavery
Right.
um, that is still with us. And this kind of um, collective wound that was perpetrated
Mm.
upon Black people, but also upon white people
Right.
by the dehumanization that it perpetrated against both races.
Yeah.
And it's not just up to Black people to heal. And I've heard that before from white people. It's
Right.
not my problem. I'm
Mm.
just living my life. And I didn't do that to them. It's their problem. But no, I would say that it's, if we're going to heal, and
Yeah.
if people who are listening are really compelled to find avenues of healing, one of the avenues of healing is talking about it.
I love that.
And anybody who's gone to therapy knows that if there's a wound, a
Mm-hmm.
deep wound that you've buried, and you feel guilty about it,
Right.
you're not going to get better by ignoring it. The guilt just
Yeah.
keeps coming, and it manifests in many different ways. According to Kate D'Angelo in White Fragility, one of
Mm-hmm.
the ways it manifests in white people is guilt. They don't want to talk about it.
Right.
That wasn't me. End of story. So this defensiveness is how it manifests in part of that deep wound that's
Right.
still in our culture. And we've got to heal, and we've got to heal together.
Yeah, no, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I love that perspective. And, what kind of conversations do you hope that Fox Creek will spark? Or, do you feel like there's maybe some issues or topics that you're hoping that people will start to wrestle with, though? Like, even as you're talking right now, like, it is uncomfortable, but like, what are you hoping that your readers can get from this book?
Well, this back to the bell curve. I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that my readers are surprised about is by how much they
Uh-huh.
like the slave owners.
Mm-hmm.
That was, while I didn't, it was my intention to present them with as much accuracy and with as little judgment as I could. So
Okay.
you take somebody with Bennett Barrows' worldview
Mm-hmm.
and you just present them on the page. And Michelle, the author, doesn't say how Michelle feels about this character.
Okay.
Okay, I leave that up to you, but I present him as authentically as I can. Okay,
Yeah.
he's well liked by his peers, but on the other hand, this is what's happening behind the scenes. And
Right.
that disconnect can be very unsettling for today's reader to read. It's
Mhm.
it's somewhat easier to read a book where the white person is all bad.
Right.
Yeah, because
Mhm.
that's not me.
Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
me. I don't connect with that person. But when I read a book where I connect with that white person, suddenly that
Right.
asks hard questions that I don't feel comfortable answering. So yeah,
Right.
I do hope that this becomes perhaps a book that people might read in book clubs
Mm-hmm.
and be open to discussing, especially in mixed race book clubs.
Right.
Yeah, I hope, and I do have discussion questions in
Okay.
the back of the book as well as on my website.
Okay, no, thank you for sharing that. So
Yeah.
something I wanted to point out too, that Chicago Book Review said that your novel gives voice to the silence. So what does it mean to you to write stories that attempt to restore silenced voices?
I think when they wrote that, now, oh,
Uh-huh.
okay, so let me say this. It
Okay.
was much easier for me to research white people than it was for me to research the slave.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Reason being, white people were literate. Okay, they wrote
Mm.
letters, they wrote books, they wrote
Okay.
autobiographies, diaries, you name it. And, I read all kinds of them and I did all kinds of research, including in archival libraries. The same cannot be said of slaves because at some point in history, it became
Mhm.
illegal for anybody to teach a slave to read. So
Okay.
the average slave who's born and who lives and dies on a plantation is completely illiterate. Are they going to write a diary? No. Are they
Right.
going to write
Right.
an autobiography? No. If anything, they'll have an oral history that might be passed down, but that's it. You'll find the oral history in a book like Roots. Okay, that
Mm-hmm.
relates an oral history.
Right.
But who is writing about the slave experience? It's the people who escaped. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You escape, you go north. Either you learned to read before you escaped, you secretly learned, and then you escaped, or you
Okay.
learned to read and write after you escaped.
Mm.
Okay. And that is a particular subset of people on this bell curve. That's not going to be who's in the middle. Okay. That's going to be a particular subset of people who, no matter what, they had to have their freedom. Okay.
Right.
It burned
Mm-hmm.
so hot in them that they would rather die than be under the lash and chain. Okay.
Okay.
And then the other subset of people were, was okay, we'll have to fast forward
Okay.
about 60 years to the 1930s during
Mm-hmm.
the Depression, um, when slaves were starting to die. Okay, ex-slaves were starting to die. The Civil War was back in the 1860s. They earned their freedom. Now we're in the
Mm-hmm.
1930s. Ex-slaves are starting to die, just like World War II vets nowadays. And President Roosevelt started what he called the Federal Writers Project, where he
Okay.
employed a bunch of writers to go out and do various things. One of the things that they did was they started to interview ex slaves. And these
Okay.
slaves recounted what it was like to be a slave. Okay, back in the day
Mm.
when I was a slave, here was what life was like. And they wrote it all down. And I've read a whole bunch of these basically oral histories.
Okay.
Now, this is also a subset because we're talking about people who were children when
Right.
they were slaves. They weren't adults, or if they were very, very young adults. So, again, that's a subset. That's not anybody who was born, who lived on the plantation, and who died. So, that we're missing this vast voice of people. So,
Okay.
so that can be part of the silence
Mm-hmm.
that Chicago Book Reviews is talking about, that I give voice to the silenced. There
Uh-huh.
is a silence in there that's not being spoken.
Right.
And so we don't really know. What we can do is surmise from the oral histories
Mm-hmm.
of children, from people like who were the oral historians in Roots, and from the people who escaped, and the scholars and all of
Okay.
the pieces of the puzzle that they've put together. We can surmise, but we can't know for sure because it's not there.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
so I did my best to try to find out who were the slaves.
Mm. Okay.
And if when I read all these voices,
Uh-huh.
again, like the slaveholders, they were everybody. It's like
Mhm.
humanity everywhere. You've got the broad spectrum of people. They were people who thought that slavery was wonderful. I was fed, I was housed, I was never beaten, and
Okay.
life was great. And then 60 years later, they've struggled to find enough food.
Mhm.
They had to live during Reconstruction when times were uncertain, and so they
Uh-huh.
may be looking back on slavery as a time of happiness. And then you go all the way over to this side of the spectrum when they were totally brutalized, and
Okay.
everybody they knew was absolutely brutalized, and you have everybody in
Right.
between. Okay, so I tried to give voice to that,
Okay.
slave experience and all the different personalities that would have existed under that experience.
Wow. No, no, no. Thank you for sharing that. And, I want to ask you too, what role do you feel that storytelling plays in advancing social justice? Do you feel that fiction gets people to think about difficult topics in ways that history textbooks aren't able to?
Yeah, I
Okay.
do. I think especially with a book like Fox Creek,
Okay.
people are realizing all the different dimensions that they hadn't
Mm,
considered before. And it does ask uncomfortable questions. I do
uh-huh.
think there are many books out there who ask the same kinds of questions and and put you kind of in that uncomfortable space.
Right.
Um, and I think those are books of tremendous literary value that are important in social justice issues and for people who are interested in the social justice issues. There are people who I would say would not want to read my book because
Okay.
it's,
Yeah.
it does, put them in that place where they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I want to read this. Maybe they'd be better with something a little more cut and dried,
Okay.
you know. Um, so it's not for
Yeah.
everybody, but
Okay.
yeah,
No, I hear that too. And I'm just thinking what you talked about earlier. Just like, I just want to live my life. But I feel like people need to also realize that that's a privilege because, for folks of color, thinking specifically even with like Black Lives Matter, when like the police killings and stuff, like people were actually having to have those kind of conversations with their kids about like, what do you do when you encounter a police officer? And for like, I think a white person not to even have to worry about that or think that they have to have those conversations with their child, like to not think about, issues that people of color have to think about in itself is a privilege. So I think it's might be hard for people, I think, to face those truths while reading your book too. But I think it's
I,
something that needs to happen in
it
order for us to
does.
start healing and start moving forward, though.
It does, absolutely. And I think, with like podcasts like this and others
Hmm.
that I've been on, I think it's a movement. I really
I think so
do. A
too.
movement toward white people starting to recognize our privilege
Hmm.
and just giving ourselves permission to talk about race, even if we talk about it poorly. I mean, we're
Right.
like first graders
Yeah.
learning to read. Um, and I think back to you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I
Hmm.
remember I was all for Black Lives Matter, on the
Okay.
heels of the George Floyd
Right.
death. And then I heard somebody say, well, all lives matter. And I remember
Yeah.
my initial response to all lives matter was, yeah, yeah, you're right, all lives matter. And then
Yeah.
my second response to that was, well, wait a second, that doesn't, there's something wrong with that. And I like, but I couldn't name it.
Okay.
I couldn't name what was wrong with that. And I remember I was with some very well-meaning friends of
Hmm.
mine who are white, and they were like, "No, all lives matter. I don't
Yeah.
think the Black Lives Matter is right. I think it's all lives matter." And I said, "Well, no, wait a second. I don't think you're right there." And I couldn't articulate it. I
Hmm.
just like stumbled over my words and ended up in just like this word soup. And
Right.
I just was like, okay, I don't know what's going on, but I really have to think about it. And so, over the weeks, I pondered it and I thought,
Mm.
why? Why does this bother me? And
Okay.
then one day I was able to name it. I was able to name it. And the reason being is because
Uh-huh.
here I go. I'm going to try to not have word soup here. Here I go.
I love that.
So, in saying Black Lives Matter, Black
Hmm.
people were saying,
Right.
don't talk over me again.
Right. Right.
Hear my story. Hear us.
Yeah.
And by saying in return, no, all lives matter, we were once again
Hmm.
silencing their voices,
Okay.
just like the plantation tours. We were whitewashing it and saying,
Right.
nope, 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 all lives matter.
Yeah.
So I could finally articulate it in a way that I couldn't before. I just knew it was wrong. So that's an
Yeah.
example of not being perfect at how
Right.
to speak, but trying anyway.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that too. And that's why I get frustrated too. It's like, yeah, we know all lives matter, but it's just that because of what was happening with all these killings, it was showing that Black lives do not matter. So it's like, having to say Black lives matter. So when people are trying to say like, no, all lives
Right,
matter, I'm like, but
right,
that's not the point though. It's showing that like it's saying against because all these killings, like they're seen as being devalued. Like by saying Black Lives Matter, it means like these lives matter more, and it's not even saying like these lives matter more than your life. It's just saying, yeah. So I think people are just kind of missing that point, I
right.
think. Or I've even heard another example with like pride, like LGBTQ,
Mhm.
that like people are wanting to have like straight like pride or something, but it's like missing the point though. It's like, yeah, but that's like every day, that's the
Right,
dominant culture. There's a
right,
reason why people have to lift each other up. That's why I get really frustrated around the
right, right.
narrative around DEI and dismantling it too, because I do a lot of like that kind of work too, and people don't realize. I don't know. It just I'm like, you don't realize that you're also being racist by saying, oh, that's a DEI hire if it's like a person of color or a person with a disability.
Exactly.
Why are you assuming that they don't have the qualifications?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The same thing happened on Great British Bake Off.
Oh,
And
really? I didn't know about
I don't
that.
know.
What
So
happened?
something bad bothered me on that.
Okay.
So a young woman, I can't remember her name, but it would
Okay.
be like 5 seasons ago. She won, and she was Muslim, and she had the, I forget what you call it, but they had scarf.
Oh,
And
okay.
I was, reading comments like on Yahoo or whatever, and someone said, yeah, she only won because she's Muslim.
Wow.
And you know, so how do you respond to that? Are you saying that
Yeah.
you know, she couldn't win without being Muslim, or
Right.
oh golly, I just that just blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's Muslim, she has no talent,
I
or
know. No, and I feel like people aren't understanding that. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, yeah. I don't, it just like, I wonder if people realize when they're saying those kind of things that they're also promoting like more white
yeah,
supremacy and white
right,
dominant culture. And
right.
yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so I just keep doing it. So my
It's a
hope is that
rare,
people actually listen to this because I'm actually trying to do the same thing with my podcast as well, like amplifying marginalized voices
yeah,
and telling those human stories behind these labels and stereotypes that people keep putting out there. So yeah, I
right,
hope that people listen to these stories with an open heart too, and just realize that no, I don't know. I just feel like a lot of times, in my opinion, I feel like the right kind of demonizes the left, and I identify as on the left, and it's just like we want to burn down the country and this and that. But like, no, it's just, there's a lot of people who have similar views as me, and they're just
right,
saying we just want more love and unity and be respected and live our lives with dignity. We're not looking
right.
to like destroy everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would identify myself with left as well.
Okay.
But and I have a lot of right friends, so to speak.
Okay.
Um, and a lot of assumptions are always made on both sides, but I would
Right.
say what my thread going through everything that I talk about is that I want unity. I want
Mm.
love. I
Yeah,
want
me
love
too.
on whether you're conservative or whether you're liberal. where's the love? Let's find
Mm.
that. Let's find that undercurrent in all things. And unless you're finding that in all things, you've gone off on a path that
Hmm.
won't serve you, and it
Yeah.
won't serve your community, and it won't serve our nation or the world. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's such beautiful work that you're doing. And I know it's not easy because I could imagine you getting a lot of like pushback, like even myself too, getting pushback. But,
yeah.
I feel like we just got to keep doing it and just moving the needle a little at a time to try to get people to have these kind of hard conversations with each other.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. You're
Yeah.
doing a great job.
No, thank you. No, but I was wondering, did writing Fox Creek change how you thought about justice, history, or human nature? Is there anything that like had you thinking about new things or anything during your process of writing this book?
Well, I think the process of researching it
Okay.
was what was so mind-blowing to me. And I
Okay.
did spend 3 years in full-time research, and most of the research I did was in primary research. And for people
Hmm.
who don't know what that is, there's secondary research, which would be like your academic books or your big coffee table books. It would be a book about the Civil War or
Okay.
something like that. And so I always start at secondary research level, and then I jot down, kind of jumping down different
Mm.
rabbit holes. I jot down all the rabbit holes I want to jump down into, and
Oh,
then take a real good look at their bibliography and who have they listed as far as their resources.
okay.
And some of the resources they list will be what we call primary resources. And that will be the actual letters, the actual diaries, the actual journals
Oh,
written
okay.
by people who lived during that time, who were eyewitnesses, whatever it might be. And so once I'm done with kind of my secondary level research, then
Mm.
I'm all about the primary level research. And that's what really gives me insight into who my characters are, what the worldviews are, and all
Okay.
all the different amazing ways that humanity expresses itself. Some hateful, some very
Mhm.
loving, and some everything in between. Um, when I was doing that research, one of my most mind-blowing moments was that moment in Bennett Barrow's journal when
Right.
he asks, "Am I a good man?" And
Hmm.
his response, his wife's response, "Oh, yes, I think you are." And him saying, "I don't believe I've ever hurt anybody in my life." Another example of that is a man named James Henry Hammond, and he
Okay.
used to actually be the governor of South Carolina.
Okay.
And he was himself a plantation owner, had a number of slaves, and he had an overseer, so the overseer would probably do the whippings and all that. But he kept a diary, and the book itself is called Secret and Sacred: The
Hmm.
Diary of James Henry Hammond. Um, and as I'm reading through, I try not to, judge people that I'm reading their letters and so on
Right.
too heavily, because I know that they're always, a creature of their time and of their culture. Always, all of us are. And so I try to see them within how they were raised, how they were born, and so on. But this guy, I couldn't help it. I found him to be despicable.
Right.
He just really was bottom of the barrel. And how he got elected into such a public office was, he must have been charismatic at a
Oh.
certain level. And also very, when the book is called Secret and Sacred, he had a lot of secrets. And one of the secrets that he kept was that he was sexually abusing his white nieces who were as young as
Oh.
13, and also sexually abusing his slaves, uh,
Okay.
it- girls as young as 12 and 13. I think he would have gotten away with it with his slaves because everybody always turned a blind eye and
Hmm.
pretended nothing was happening.
Wow.
But with the white children, it hit the fan, and he had to leave the governorship in disgrace. Well, fast forward 10 years, he's on his deathbed. He doesn't know it's his deathbed, but he's on his deathbed, and
Hmm.
he's writing in his diary, and he is lamenting the fact
Okay.
that he has been deserted by everybody in his life, all of his relatives,
Wow.
even all of his servants. And he said, nobody visits me. Why? He
Yeah.
says, am I not a good man?
Mm.
I have never done anything wrong to anybody as long as I have lived. And I just
Wow.
wanted to put my finger down my throat and puke. I
Yeah.
mean, it was like Bennett Barrow, but 10 times worse.
Right.
And I'm like, how self-deceptive this man was in his life. Anyway, so yes, I learned a lot about humanity.
Okay.
Um, I learned a lot, and I also learned about the greatness of humanity as well.
Hmm.
Reading from the writings of people like Frederick Douglass.
Right.
Frederick Douglass was a former black slave who escaped to the North, very literate, and he became an abolitionist and
Hmm.
was soon on the stages throughout, cities of the North giving speeches. And he was very fiery, and his, the halls were always packed with people listening
Yeah.
to his speeches. Um, reading his writings and how, he couldn't stay a slave. Just wasn't within him. And to read about somebody like that,
Right.
it's the best of humanity, and then juxtaposed against the worst of humanity. I just learned so
Yeah.
much reading those kinds of things, and I think if people want to learn about that kind of thing, getting down into those kinds of writings, it's just amazing what you
Right.
hear.
Right. No, thank you for sharing. And, thank you so much for your time. I had such a wonderful conversation with you. I really hope that people, even just listening to this conversation, can get something out of it and, inspire action. Definitely want them to read your book as well. But,
Yeah.
something that I want to do with this podcast too is have my listeners take away like tangible takeaways after listening to these conversations. So, with that, for listeners who want to
Mhm.
engage more deeply with difficult history, where would you encourage them to start?
Oh gosh, well, start with the book White Fragility, I'd
Okay.
say. And then, well, I'd say books like 12 Years as a Slave, and it is an autobiography. And then, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, books
Hmm.
by Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. Those are excellent ways to start. And then from those books,
Yeah.
you can just, read. Uh, Usually you'll find it being edited by certain people, and look up
Okay.
those editors and what other books have they edited or read. And I find that kind of thing very, very important. Books about the Civil War as well, not just from a
Hmm.
Northern standpoint, but also from a Southern standpoint, and some of the struggles that they went through in their culture and their society during that time. Very eye-opening.
Right. No, thank you. And thank you again for your time. And, just lastly, as we're wrapping up, how can people find you if they like to connect with you? And also, how can they get your book as well?
Okay, so they can visit my website at
Okay.
Torrey, Torrey.com, and they
Mhm.
can read more about me, or there's also links to buy my book there, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. But I would also encourage people to go to bookshop.org, and that
Mhm.
supports your local independent bookstore.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again. You're doing such wonderful and, inspirational and powerful work. And, I wish you all the best. And not only are you telling stories, but, you're also inspiring actions. So I thank you for that. And, I hope that we can stay connected and I hope that you have a good rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and you carry on
Yeah.
your good work as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for being here and tuning in to Voices That Propel Us, stories of justice, action, and community. Your presence in this movement matters. If today's conversation moved you, share it, talk about it, and keep the work going. Together, we're not just imagining change, we're making it. Until next time, stay bold, stay grounded, and stay in the fight.
Every time I feel so mad and sad and bad, I say to myself, relax, lean back, it's a brand new day. And every time I feel feel so down that a frown is all that's on my face. I remind myself to take a breath. It's a brand new